One of the most important things in entertainment is first impressions. If you fail to make a strong good one, it might all be over. And I think that nothing else shows that better than 2022's Despair Memory Gundam sequel. Imagine, if you will, that you're a casual Gundam fan and you see this new manga from your favorite franchise come out. Boom, page 1. The very first Gundam is strung up like a crucifix, being burned and permanently destroyed. A ruined symbol of a time long lost. Then only a few pages later, there is this edgelord woman completely engulfed in flames, later completely naked, and relentlessly murdering royalty. Then after a few pages of constant uncomfortable ass shots, we end up learning that she was born out of a flaming corpse's womb. Yet even a few pages later, she rips a gun out of her intestines. And if all of that wasn't a radical enough first introduction, we haven't even gotten into the lore yet. And in that regard, it's maybe even rougher. Because guess what? This claims to be connected to Gundam's Universal Century, the core Gundam timeline that everything else stems from. Unlike many other iterations of the future of this timeline, Despair Memory depicts a very depressing and drab outlook on the future of the franchise. We hear of a great war 700 years ago, not all that dissimilar to the one-year war from Gundam 079, and we also hear of a heroic generation of new types, but instead of them fulfilling the hopes and dreams of new type philosophers, their lives were snuffed out when they outlived their usefulness. The Federation sent them to a doomed colony they planned to gas. As such, this colony, called Cocytus, was never heard of again for 700 years. This backstory almost feels like a deconstruction of what the timeline had been building up to this point. It's the ultimate dark fate, the ultimate snuffing out of the hero's dreams. If you view this strictly as a part of canon, it feels like maybe the biggest insult to the franchise and everything it stands for, where Gundam inspires people to better themselves, rise to the occasion, promising better times to come. Despair Memory says, no matter how hard you try, it's all over, it's all gonna go to crap anyway. Another way this alienates its core audience is that robots don't even show up for half of the storyline, which is just utterly absurd for a series about giant robots. The worst part of it all is that the writer of this, Toshiki Ino, comes across as an outsider. He's never worked on Gundam before, only a lot of Kamen Rider and Sword Guy, so it's natural to question the story's legitimacy. As a final point to really drive home just how absurd and how much of a bad impression this makes, the artist of this series only makes softcore gooner stuff.
She kinda bad though.
To the average onlooker, Despair Memory misunderstands the franchise it's adapting, disrespects the lore, and is made by people who do not understand the franchise. So I think it's very natural for people to have dropped it. However, there is a reason I started this video by saying first impression, rather than just dogging on this from the start. And that's because I actually kinda really like this series. Okay, I know how it seems. Just hear me out, okay? The first hurdle to get over when getting into the series is that you just really have to accept that this is not actually UC, but rather an alternate timeline. I don't think this is confirmed anywhere, but it becomes incredibly obvious as soon as you start to notice that the new type heroes in this don't look like the ones we've seen in the past. The second major hurdle is that you need to understand that this is actually not a sci-fi. This is a dark fantasy. When you look at the story this way, it actually becomes pretty interesting in a couple of ways. See, I actually lied to you a little bit. The settlers on Cocytus, the space colony the new types were isolated on, actually wasn't gassed. They found a way to survive, and now that colony that developed in isolation away from the rest of the solar system is the core setting of the entire story. It's actually kind of interesting to think about how would they develop their own culture and their own society for 700 years. 700 years ago in our own world was so alien from what we know now. See, the space colonists have now developed their own Romance of the Three Kingdom-esque societies. If you don't know what the Romance of the Three Kingdoms is, it's basically this warring period in China where three kingdoms were all fighting each other to try to unify China under their own banner. This is the concept that stuff like Fire Emblem Three Houses is based on. And when I saw they were going in that direction, I literally got so excited. It is such a cool concept that fits the Gundam world so well. Having three kingdoms at war is such a neat political device that can showcase nuance and different cultures in a way that Gundam always has. And honestly, it's just such a cool idea to think about. In this case, the war is between Gundorado, a more traditional take on space aristocracy, similar to the Crossbone Vanguard of Gundam F91, Mufasa, an Egyptian-inspired civilization, and finally Daria, a civilization of religious devotees, like the Vatican. And this is where the kind of dark fantasy comes in, because the pillars of each of their societies are their gods. Gundam Minerva, Gundam Anubis, and Gundam Dis. See, following all of the Gundams being destroyed post-war, the only remaining ones were the ones that the new types had, and as a result of their rarity and their hard-to-control nature, they had become deified. That's where it really started to click for me. For a while, it's hard to understand why we're even touching on UC in the first place. The reason is they're trying to use that core iconography and mythology that we are aware of to streamline the lore and to give us extra information from the get-go. For example, in another story, we wouldn't immediately understand that the gods these people are worshipping are false. However, in this story, we immediately know that the faith in the series is misguided. The sheer gravitas of all the new types being betrayed isn't as clear if you don't know what new types are. And the Gundams becoming deified is actually a very interesting idea, because in UC, following the 1 Year War, Gundams weren't really imposing or special or intimidating anymore because we had so many of them. This series brings back that niche that the original Gundam had. In that series, the emergence of the RX-78-2 turned the tides of the entire war. It was even called the White Devil by the Zeon forces. To them, it was something beyond just a robot. It was a force of nature. In this series, yet again, Gundams are larger than life because of their increased rarity. They're not just a slightly stronger robot. That's something that's really cool about this with the alternate UC timeline knowledge that you have in your head. When you start to examine this on its own merits, it's very confidently different in a way that's very refreshing for this franchise. And I find that the Gundam world is interesting and expansive enough that it allows for exploration like this. I was immediately drawn in by the setting, and I think that many of you guys will be too, especially if you're willing to be open-minded about it. That aspect is really what got me through the first 8 chapters. The main character in this, that I've called Edgy Flame Woman up to this point, her name is actually Shagi Kaoris, or that's just how I'm pronouncing her name because we don't have a vocal version yet. And the thing about her, another dark fantasy concept, is that she is a Neos, which is like a vampire basically. They have regenerative abilities and like blood powers. I'm gonna be real with you, Chief. She really is just the worst part of this story. She's just painfully edgy, like Shadow the Hedgehog levels. And the driving force of the first 8 chapters is about her vague backstory. But the story really starts to pick up in chapter 9. Chapter 9 establishes our second main Neos and second major Gundam pilot, Lady June, a nun in the Church of Dis, which is a play on the Catholic Church in how it has confessionals and even a focus on repentance and sin, which Shagi obviously acts like a Redditor about.
You look like you're about to tell your friend not to come to school tomorrow, man.
I like June a lot. Even though she feels a little bit heretical, she feels a lot more morally ambiguous and deeply scarred than Kaoris in a more subtle way. We see that while her faith is ultimately a false one, she is doing good in the world. Her character hasn't gone too far yet. The series is still ongoing, but I'm liking her a lot so far. Then the story became low-key peak in chapter 11, which is our introduction to our third main character, Princess Marinon, and the pilot of Gundam Anubis. Similarly to the other 2 main characters, she has an edgy past and is mentally broken. Yet, instead of becoming a Redditor, her response to trauma and isolation seems to have resulted in her becoming infantilized, stunted in maturity. Yet even still, violence also comes to her naturally, and as a result of these conflicting aspects to her nature and the dichotomy at the core of her character, her pilot in Gundam Anubis is striking, thematically rich, and nuanced in a great way. From this point on, nearly every chapter has had an awesome mecha fight, and all 3 of the new Gundams are just so slick and fun to watch. The series utilizes darkness, atmosphere, and frankly amazing composition that I didn't know this artist was capable of to emphasize the action. And you really just start to think, why is this not what they led with? Now we know Despair Memory has been revealed to us as a dark fantasy video game-esque story with dark characters, a unique setting, and amazing mobile suits. And it hasn't even reached its boiling point yet. This is literally what everyone wanted from this. But for almost a solid year of issues, it was an episodic assassin story with no robots. And most people won't get far enough to care because of the start. They easily could have just skipped the cringe and started with Marinen's perspective. This is the storyline with mobile suits, with a main character that we can actually root for. It feels like they wanted to make a bad first impression, and I'm not sure if they can get over that now. But since I stuck with it, I can now promise you that this series is much closer to normal Gundam goodness. I'm actually really looking forward to more chapters coming out. The first impression is just really so frustrating, because now my biggest concern is that this will end up cancelled before fully exploring its ideas. It really just needs to stick with what it has, continue to showcase cool robots, and double down on the weird lore. Get even weirder, get even crazier. That's all I got. Thanks for listening to my ramblings. I really appreciate likes, comments, subscriptions, any way you can support me, because I'm making videos about crap no one cares about. God bless you guys. See you next time. Peace.